The war on terror was a construct that was rolled out on the global stage in July 1979 in Israel, in the Netanyahu Institute. They had a conference called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, and this was a conference that was a 3-day event. It was sponsored by the government of Israel, which was then headed by Menachem Begin, and Mr. Netanyahu and his father were the main coordinators. George Herbert Walker Bush spoke there, who was then a candidate for vice president or president in 1979. And at the conference, the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, they rolled out this doctrine, this idea that the United States and the Western allies should become engaged militarily in the Middle East to fight the terrorist groups who were plaguing Israel and the nations that harbored or hosted these organizations. Well, at this event, they promoted this idea that the Western allies should come and fight they called it Islamic terrorism, because in the construct that Netanyahu puts forward on fighting the war on terror, he says that basically Israel is plagued by Islamic terrorists because it is a Western state with Western values. Therefore, he says, Israel is attacked because they're the furthest out in the region. But the real target, he says, of Islamic terrorism is the West. Therefore, he says it's incumbent on the West and the United States to lead a war on terrorism against these groups because it's in the West's interest. So he conflates Israel and the terrorism problem in Israel with Western values, which is a little bit off the mark there, because he ignores the Palestinian grievances that they have, fighting occupation. And they presented this in July of 1979 at the conference. The logic was flawed, the data was inaccurate, but never mind, it was rolled out as a concept, as a doctrine. And George Herbert Walker Bush spoke at the final session in agreement with the idea that the United States should engage in a war on terrorism. There was a book, Netanyahu put a book together called, based on the speeches of these people. It's called International Terrorism, Challenges and Responses. Then he, in the following years, he wrote several other books, Fighting Terrorism and Terrorism, How the West Can Win. And that became his career, promoting this idea. So they had created the construct of an idea where Western nations should come to the Middle East and fight Islamic terrorism. But they needed a face for that Islamic terrorism. So that happened when they created something called Al-Qaeda in the mid-'80s. Specifically in 1983, 84, and 85, the United States began arming a group in Pakistan of Afghani resistance fighters that was headed by a man named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And this faction, called Hezb Islami, was an odd group for the CIA to be funding, because they got the lion's share of the money from the CIA and Saudi Arabia, but they were an extremely anti-Western group. And furthermore, when the United States began this operation, the money, as I said, came from the CIA and Saudi Arabia, but the actual weapons and the training came from Israeli military intelligence. So what the Israelis were doing is they were selling the weapons that they had gotten off the battlefield in Lebanon in '82. So it was old Russian stuff. And then they were designing some weapons that could be used to shoot down the Russian helicopters. And this weaponry was being taken to Pakistan. And then it was on the front lines for these guys who would then cross into Afghanistan with the weapons. And Israeli military intelligence agents were the ones who were training these people, because Israeli military intelligence has a lot of people who speak fluent Arabic and look Arabic and sound Arabic, so they can play the role. And this was being done, it's documented in a book called Charlie Wilson's War, about how he, together with the Mossad station chief in Washington, were making these plans and making this all happen. And the interesting thing about this is that at the time that this was being done, in 1983, 84, and 85, this is the time when Ehud Barak was the head of Israeli military intelligence. And this is exactly the same time that Osama bin Laden makes his entry into Pakistan and becomes friends with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And then later, in 1994, this group that they had cultivated, this cadre of terrorism, was dismissed by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and found itself in a lurch, and then they merged into Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And that became the boogeyman. That entity that they had created then became the Al-Qaeda boogeyman, Osama bin Laden being the most notorious or well-known of these Afghan Arabs who had gone to Pakistan to fight with the Mujahideen. So then, already by the mid 80s, they've created the construct of the war on terrorism, and they've created the boogeyman, the bad guy, the Al-Qaeda. And then they just needed, in order to make the war on terror operational and to go into effect, they needed simply to have the match that lit the fire. And that was September 11th. There was a lot of ideation about September 11th going back to the 70s. As I said, in 1979, they rolled out this concept of doing it. The year prior to that, they had made a movie. The Israeli agent named Arnon Milchan had made a movie called Medusa Touch, in which the climactic scene is a Boeing 747 crashing into the Pan Am building. And all of this came about in the mid-70s, or late 70s, in my opinion, because this is the time when the Likud party came to power in Israel. Menachem Begin had created the Likud party in 1973, and then 4 years later, in 1977, he took power. And when that group came to power, that was a fundamental change in the structure of Israel, because you then had the former heads of the terrorist organizations, like Irgun and Stern Gang, coming into the highest level of the Israeli government as policymakers and as people who had enacted the policies of the state. And when terrorists are put in power, what do you expect but terrorism? What else is one to expect? And that's what we got. In 1977, they came to power. Immediately the next year, they invaded Lebanon in 1978, where they remained until 2002. They went back into Lebanon in 1982 with a big invasion. Again, Israel overextended its abilities. They went to the Litani River, but they couldn't hold that territory. So they asked the Americans to come in and send peacekeepers. Peacekeepers in an occupied country. There's no peace to be kept. So the Americans and the French and the Italians sent soldiers there. And of course, we know what happened. The Americans got killed in huge numbers in the embassy bombing and the bombing at the Beirut barracks. But this was the first attempt by Israel to get the United States to hold a line, to create a buffer state, to basically to secure their perimeter for them. And it was a disaster. Ronald Reagan pulled the troops out, and that was the end of that. But they then went forward with their plan to do this on a grand scale. And 9/11 was that operation. 9/11 was meant to deceive the American people into thinking that the United States is under attack by Arabs and Muslims, and it was therefore in our best interest to wage war against them. And they passed a bill in Congress called the Authorization to Use Force, and that is the legislation that the president has been using ever since to wage war in countries from Libya to Iraq to Somalia. America right now is currently engaged in a half a dozen conflicts in the Middle East, and we've already destroyed 5 nations, I think it is. Basically left 5 nations on the side of the road. And what's difficult about this, or problematic, is that in the U.S. government today, we're facing an election coming up, and this election campaign's gone on for 2 years. But I just returned from America, and what's peculiar is that the strategy of war that they're using in Syria is called a non-issue in the election. That means it's not discussed. It's not talked about. It's not talked about by the media. It's not talked about either the leading candidates. So we have a nation that's at war, deeply in war in many countries, but that's not discussed in the political election campaign. All they talk about is, did Trump call Hillary a bigot? Did Hillary call Trump a bigot? It's pseudo-issues. The real issues of war and peace are not even discussed. And that's our predicament. And it's a predicament not only for the United States and Americans, but because of the structure of this NATO alliance, it affects all the countries in NATO. Just yesterday, Obama signed legislation was passed, which will provide Israel with $38 billion over the next 10 years which is basically a 30% increase in their funding over a 10-year period. It's a massive amount of money. Why do we give all this money to Israel? Well, it's very easy to see. Is that in the United States, the Zionist enterprise, the Zionist organizations, they work as a collective. They work hand in hand, and they're very organized, and they have a lot of political influence. So they're instrumental in choosing the candidates who run for office. They're very instrumental in seeing which candidates get elected. And if a candidate for congressional office or the presidency turns against Israel in any way, or votes against Israeli legislation in any way, they'll find in the next election that Zionist money is used against them, and they're out of office. So it's basically the understanding among politicians in America that if they want to stay in office, they go along with the Zionist line and what the lobby calls for. So you see these American politicians like Hillary Clinton and Mr. Trump speaking at AIPAC, which is the Israeli lobby, and they're egregious in their obsequiousness to this lobby, which is a foreign lobby after all. It's a foreign lobby. So we're giving money to a state, a little tiny state in the Middle East, which is a discriminatory state based on race or religion, which is completely contrary to American values. And our support for that state has brought us into the position where we are fighting its wars for him, for it, for her, whatever they want. And this is a complete corruption of our basic fundamental values as Americans. And it's a crime. Because the United States has now been engaged in wars on behalf of Israel in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Libya, in Somalia, in Yemen. But the war, as we know from the Chilcot inquiry in England, the war in Iraq, the Anglo-American war in Iraq, was a de facto war crime. It was a war of aggression. And at least in England, they found Mr. Blair responsible. So now Tony Blair is close to being held, indictable for war crimes. We need something like that in the United States. We have nothing like that. In the United States, Obama simply said, when he became elected president, we're looking forward. We're not going to look backward and see what Mr. Bush did wrong. We're not going to revisit those crimes that he committed. We're looking forward. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. So you let the former president of the United States get away with complete and utter war crimes in which over 1 million people have been killed, in which trillions of dollars have been spent, and America's prestige has been put in the gutter? It's absurd. The political campaigns in America, presidential campaigns, even when they last 2 years or 3 years like this one has, they're circus. They're really a circus in which you have two-party system. Third parties are kept on the margins. You don't hear very much from them. And in which the candidates that are given to us are selected by some unseen hand, by some hidden hand. And these people appear. I mean, it was absurd in the beginning. They presented Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton, members of the two most notorious crime families in America, as the only candidates. It was crazy. Well, then Jeb Bush, of course, was completely incompetent as a politician. And then we came up with this Trump fella. But in both cases, Trump and Clinton, they called for renewed vigor in fighting the war on terror. They want stronger actions against ISIS. Hillary Clinton has said things like she would obliterate Iran. This is heavy talk. This is a talk of psychopaths. But this is what we have in America to choose from. And so the media in America is so completely artificial that people's understanding of the real world or what happened on September 11th or the war on terror is completely inadequate. The Americans don't have the understanding of what's going on in the world because their entire media is completely taken up with pseudo issues. Some of the pseudo issues are pretty important. I mean, they talk about now, of course, they're talking about race in America a lot because there's clearly an attempt by people like George Soros to inflame tensions between white and black, Anglo-Hispanic, gay and straight, so that the body politic is fractured in every different way. So they're doing to the United States exactly what they did to Iraq. the way that Bernie Sanders had said early on that he would, if he didn't win, he would give his support to Hillary. And Hillary being so completely contrary to his values. And then when the Democrats had their convention, and when Bernie Sanders caved so easily, he gave in without a fight, this seemed very peculiar. Because if he was sincerely behind his principles, and if he sincerely wanted to make a difference in the election, I would think that he should have fought harder and demanded a higher compromise from the Clinton side, rather than just cave. That made no sense. And the people, the Democrats in America, are really upset about that. The Israeli influence on 9/11 began very early, just on the day of the event, actually. Before the towers even fell, the former Israeli Prime Minister and Chief of Staff, Ehud Barak, was in the London studio of BBC World Television, the largest English-speaking network in the world. And he was giving his analysis of what we saw that day, before either tower had fallen. The planes had hit, but the towers had not fallen. And he basically said, the world will never be the same from today on. He says, we know who's behind this. It's Osama bin Laden, and we know where he is. And he said, now it's time to begin an operational, concrete war on terror. And that very brief analysis that Israel's highest soldier presented to the English-speaking world became the actual myth of 9/11. Now, of course, as we know, the evidence of explosives and nanothermite and many other problems indicate that the narrative we've been given about 9/11 is false. But for 15 years now, that narrative has been protected by the media in a most unusual way. We supposedly live in a democratic nation in the United States, but almost all the media is owned by 6 companies, 6 corporations. And they are all lockstep in unison supporting the 9/11 false narrative. And that false narrative has been used to take us into a war, a global war on terror, which is an Israeli construct. And all of the people who are involved in the cover-up are themselves supporters of the state of Israel at the highest level, or they are Israelis themselves. So it's like President Nixon said, it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. Because although we don't know who put nanothermite in the World Trade Center or how they did it, we know it was there, and we know who's covering it up, because the cover-up goes on and on and on. We now have 15 years of cover-up. And so the media and the government are in unison blocking 9/11 truth from coming out to the public. So that gives us an understanding of how serious our political problem is in America, because it's obvious that the government and media are controlled by the same people who carried out 9/11. That's a pretty serious state of affairs.